It starts with a sentence that sounds too perfect to be true. D-Day was saved because of one woman. Think about that for a second. June 6th, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history. Thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, entire armies moving like a machine, one mistake away from catastrophe. Men packed shoulder to shoulder in landing craft, praying the sea would be kinder than the guns waiting on the beach. And somewhere in the shadow of that massive storm of steel and courage, we're told there was a single female spy, one person, who changed the outcome. How? Did she steal Hitler's plans out of a briefcase? Did she seduce a German general and redirect the panzer divisions with a whisper? Did she send one radio message that made the Atlantic Wall crumble? That's the hook, the kind of story the internet loves. Clean, sharp, heroic, but war doesn't usually work that way. Because D-Day wasn't a coin toss decided by a single hand. It was a brutal sum of thousands of decisions, countless acts of deception, and an ocean of blood. And yet, this myth refuses to die. Why? Because in every war, we search for a human face to attach to something too big to understand. We want a name, a portrait, a single heartbeat we can follow through the chaos. And if that face happens to be a woman, an overlooked figure in a world that tried to erase women from the story of combat and intelligence, then the legend becomes even more powerful. It's not hard to see why people want it to be true. Women did serve. They ran messages through occupied streets. They carried explosives under coats. They typed encoded transmissions with shaking hands while listening for footsteps on the stairs. They flew under the radar because the enemy underestimated them until it was too late. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If you tell the story wrong, if you exaggerate it into a fairy tale, you don't honor these women. You bury them under myth. Because the real world of espionage wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a lipstick pistol and a wink. It was hunger, fear, and silence. It was paper money hidden in shoe soles. It was cyanide capsules sewn into hems. It was the knowledge that if you were caught, you wouldn't be treated like a soldier. You would be treated like a criminal, and you would disappear. So when someone claims, this female spy changed D-Day, we have to ask the hard questions. What does changed even mean? Changed the landing site? Changed the timing? Changed German troop movements? Changed weather decisions? Changed what Hitler believed? Because for D-Day to succeed, the Allies didn't just need bravery. They needed Germany to be confused, to keep believing the invasion would come somewhere else, or later, or not at all. They needed delays, misplaced confidence, wrong assumptions. And that kind of confusion doesn't come from one dramatic moment. It comes from a system, a network, 1,000 small lies stacked on top of each other until the enemy can't see the truth even when it's right in front of them. And that's where our story begins. Not with a miracle, but with a question. Somewhere, in books and documentaries, online threads and whispered, "Did you know?" Videos. A particular tale gets repeated. A woman in enemy territory who passed along information so crucial that it altered the German response to the invasion. Sometimes she's described as a courier, sometimes as a radio operator, sometimes as a double agent with ice in her veins. Her name changes depending on who's telling it. The details morph. The tone becomes more dramatic every time it's repeated. But the claim always lands in the same place. Without her, D-Day might have failed. So tonight, we're going to do two things at once. We're going to tell the story the way it's usually told. Tense, dangerous, human. And we're going to test it. No cheap cynicism. No cold academic takedown. Just a straight question, asked respectfully. Did one female spy truly change D-Day? Or did history get sharpened into a legend because the truth was harder to explain? Because the first piece of evidence people point to sounds convincing. It's always the same kind of proof. A message, a report, A single act that supposedly moved entire divisions like chess pieces. A lone transmission, sent from the dark, claimed to have reached the right hands at the right moment. A message that, if real, would mean one woman's voice rippled all the way to the beaches of Normandy. And the next question is the most terrifying one of all. If that message existed, who received it? Because if the wrong person did, if the Germans intercepted it, then she didn't change D-Day. She signed her own death warrant, and she may have dragged an entire network down with her. If you want to understand, whether one woman could change D-Day, you have to stop imagining spies as lone wolves and start seeing them as threads in a web. Because by 1944, the Allied war wasn't just fought with rifles and tanks. It was fought with belief. What the Germans believed about the invasion mattered almost as much as where the invasion actually landed. And the Allies built an entire machine to control that belief. Fake armies, dummy tanks, inflatable vehicles parked in fields like theater props, radio traffic designed to sound like real divisions maneuvering in southern England, double agents feeding Berlin a steady diet of misinformation, carefully measured so it wouldn't look like a lie. The aim wasn't to convince Germany of one falsehood. It was to trap them inside a pattern, to make the Pas de Calais feel inevitable, to make Normandy feel like a feint, to make every German officer who doubted the story seem paranoid, irrational, the kind of man who panics at shadows. And that's the first problem with the one female spy changed D-Day claim. Because the biggest lever of D-Day intelligence, deception, wasn't usually pulled by a single person. It was a synchronized chorus. But that doesn't mean one person couldn't matter. Not at all. In a web, one cut string can make an entire structure sag. And in occupied Europe, the people holding those strings were often women. Couriers, safe housekeepers, code clerks, radio operators who moved like ghosts through cities full of informers. Women who could pass roadblocks easier than men, until the Germans learned to stop underestimating them. And once they did, the job became a death sentence. Picture it. You're in a cramped room with blackout curtains. A radio set hums quietly, wires like veins across the floor. You have minutes, sometimes seconds, to transmit before German direction-finding equipment starts triangulating your location. Too long on the air, and a van full of men is already turning onto your street. There's no chase scene, no dramatic escape, just boots on stairs, a fist on the door, and then the question every agent feared more than death. Who else do you know? Because espionage wasn't just about information, it was about pressure. The Germans didn't have to break your code. They could break you. They could turn one arrest into 20. One captured radio into an entire network rolled up like a rug. Resistance groups, built over years, could vanish in a weekend. That's why the smartest agents lived like they were already dead. They used false names, false papers, dead drops, one-time pads. They memorized messages and burned notes. They carried pills for the moment the door finally gave way. And this is where the female spy changed D-Day legend usually starts to attach itself to a very specific kind of character. A woman who sent a message that supposedly reached London. Maybe about German troop movements. Maybe about fortifications. Maybe about where reserves were positioned. A message that supposedly shaped Allied decisions. But here's what the legend rarely tells you. By the time D-Day arrived, the Allies had multiple intelligence streams. Aerial reconnaissance, photos that could map defenses and identify positions, signals intelligence, intercepted German communications, where readable, resistance reports, human eyes on the ground, double agents, controlled channels feeding Berlin false certainty. So for one message from one person to change D-Day, it would have to do something extraordinary. It would need to reveal something the Allies didn't already know, or confirm something at a critical moment, or expose a German move early enough to matter. That's a high bar. Not impossible, but high. And it's exactly why myths form here. Because when you don't understand the scale of the machine, you assume the machine must have been steered by a single heroic hand. Now, let's talk about names, because this is where the story becomes slippery. Depending on the video, the book, the podcast, the "Did you know" thread, the supposed woman behind the D-Day Changing Act is often described in broad strokes. SOE agent, French resistance, double agent, courier, radio operator. Sometimes the storyteller points to someone real, someone brave, documented, and absolutely deserving of remembrance, then stitches her story to D-Day as if history needs a cleaner ending. Sometimes they point to a figure from counterintelligence, an agent in Britain feeding misinformation to the Germans, and claim she personally redirected Nazi strategy. And sometimes they point to a single smoking gun document, a message log, a decrypted note, a report that seems to show a direct line between a woman's transmission and German decision-making. It looks convincing because it's paper, and paper feels final. But paper can lie in war. It can be misread. It can be taken out of context. It can be forged, exaggerated, misattributed, or, most commonly, misinterpreted by people who desperately want a clean story. So in the next part, we're going to take that proof and hold it up to the light. We're going to reconstruct the moment the legend points to, the turning point. And we're going to ask one question that decides everything. Was this message truly a weapon that helped the Allies? Or was it a thread pulled by someone else entirely? Someone whose job was to make sure Germany believed the wrong thing until it was too late. Because if that's true, then the female spy who changed D-Day isn't a hero story. It's a story about being used. And the person who received her message may not have been an ally at all. Every legend has a heartbeat, a single moment where everything seems to hinge on one action, one choice, one message sent into the dark. For the story of the female spy who changed D-Day, this moment is always the same, even when the details shift. A transmission, a report passed through occupied Europe, a warning or a confirmation delivered at just the right time. The claim goes like this. Shortly before the invasion, a woman embedded in enemy territory sends information so critical that it influences how the Germans deploy their forces, or how the Allies interpret the battlefield. According to the myth, this act helps keep German reserves away from Normandy long enough for the landings to survive the first bloody hours. It sounds plausible, almost elegant, but to understand what actually happened, we need to slow the story down, strip away the music, the narration, the dramatic pauses, and rebuild the moment as it really would have unfolded. Picture the days before June 6, 1944. German commanders are exhausted. They've been warned about an invasion for years. False alarms have come and gone. Exercises, feints, raids. Every coastal movement could be the one. Or just another deception. Hitler himself is convinced the main landing will come at the Pas-de-Calais. Not because of one report, but because everything points there. Geography, proximity, Allied buildup, radio chatter, double agents confirming his expectations. Normandy feels wrong to him. Too obvious, too far. Now imagine a message arrives, filtered through resistance channels, or intercepted and evaluated, or folded into a growing pile of intelligence. It mentions activity, troop movement, preparations, something that could be read as significant. Here's where the legend inserts the woman. She is said to be the source, the human origin of that message. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Even if she did send such a report, it would not have landed on a single desk and triggered a single decision. It would have been one voice in a crowded room. German intelligence didn't operate on cinematic clarity. Reports were delayed, summarized, translated, questioned, and often dismissed if they didn't fit what leadership already believed. A warning about Normandy, if it contradicted the larger narrative, was more likely to be seen as part of Allied deception. In fact, that was the genius of the Allied plan. They didn't just lie, They made the truth look like a lie. So when stories claim that a woman's message misled the Germans, they often miss the deeper irony. Many truthful reports about Normandy were ignored because of the deception web already in place, which leads us to the crucial twist. Some of the most famous female spies linked to D-Day narratives weren't working in France at all. They were working in Britain. Double agents, controlled assets, individuals whose communications were monitored, edited, and sometimes outright written by Allied intelligence before being passed to Germany. Their job was to reinforce German misconceptions, not to reveal reality. In those cases, the woman didn't independently change D-Day. She was part of a larger script, and that doesn't make her less brave. It makes her role more tragic and more dangerous. Because if Germany had ever suspected the truth, these agents would not have been captured. They would have been erased. Now, let's address the core of the legend head-on. Did any single report from a woman cause German armored divisions to stay away from Normandy? No. That decision was driven by Hitler's personal control over reserves, his fixation on Pas-de-Calais, poor weather assumptions, and a command structure so rigid that local commanders couldn't move tanks without permission. By the time anyone in Berlin began to suspect Normandy might be the real landing, the invasion was already unfolding. Beaches were already red. Paratroopers were already scattered across hedgerows. The window to stop D-Day had closed. So where does that leave the woman at the center of the story? Here's the truth most versions avoid saying out loud. She mattered, but not in the way the myth claims. Her courage wasn't a cinematic turning point. It was something quieter. She was one of many who kept information flowing, who took risks so others could plan with better clarity, who operated in a system where success meant anonymity and survival was never guaranteed. The problem with saying she changed D-Day is that it suggests D-Day hinged on a single fragile act. It didn't. But war myths love singular heroes because they're easier to remember than systems, networks, and uncomfortable complexity. And yet, there is one way in which a woman truly did influence the fate of D-Day. Not by revealing the truth, but by helping to hide it in plain sight. A role so subtle that even today, it's often misunderstood. And in the next part, we're going to dismantle the myth completely, without stripping away the bravery behind it. Because when you see what she actually did, you may realize the real story is more unsettling than the legend. And it forces us to ask a final question. Was the world praising the wrong achievement because it couldn't handle the real one? By now, the legend should feel uncomfortable, not because it's built on nothing, but because it's built on something real that's been stretched too far. So let's strip the claim down to its bones. Did a woman serve as an agent, courier, or controlled source connected to the intelligence environment around D-Day? Yes. Did women play essential roles in the deception and resistance networks that protected the invasion? Absolutely. Did any single female spy, acting alone, redirect the course of D-Day itself? No. And here's why that matters. The success of D-Day rested on three immovable pillars: scale, timing, and confusion. No single human being, man or woman, could meaningfully alter all three. The landing sites were chosen months in advance. The weather window was razor thin. The German response was constrained by centralized command, internal rivalries, and Hitler's obsession with being deceived again. Even if a German officer had believed a lone report warning that Normandy was real, he likely could not have moved armored divisions without approval. And approval did not come. Because the deception worked. That deception had a name: Operation Fortitude. And it depended on a cruel paradox. The Allies needed Germany to keep receiving information, some true, some false, so that nothing stood out. Resistance reports about Normandy didn't fail because they were wrong. They failed because they were indistinguishable from lies. Now, here's the dangerous part of the myth. When people say, "This woman changed D-Day," they often collapse an entire intelligence ecosystem into a single heroic gesture. In doing so, They accidentally imply that everyone else, the planners, the resistance networks, the analysts, the soldiers who died on the beaches, were waiting on one message. That's not respect. That's distortion. But the correction isn't to dismiss the woman at the center of the story. It's to understand what she actually did. If she was a resistance courier, she risked death every time she crossed a street. If she was a radio operator, she lived with a clock ticking over her head. Broadcast too long and you vanished. If she was a double agent, she lived in a world where both sides would kill her the moment trust broke. Her courage wasn't measured in strategic outcomes. It was measured in survival. And here's the twist most simplified versions never mention. Some female agents associated with D-Day intelligence weren't shaping German decisions at all. They were shaping German confidence. Their job was to make Berlin feel comfortable waiting, comfortable delaying, comfortable believing the real invasion was still coming somewhere else. That meant feeding just enough believable information to keep the lie alive. If that sounds morally murky, it's because it was. These women weren't celebrated during the war. Many couldn't even tell their families what they'd done afterward. Some were never officially acknowledged at all, because acknowledging them would expose methods, sources, and names that intelligence services wanted buried forever. So when the post-war world looked back and asked, who saved D-Day? It reached for a story it could tell, a face, a heroine, a single turning point. And in doing so, it replaced reality with something safer. But history isn't safer when it's simplified. Because if we pretend D-Day could have been changed by one person, we misunderstand how fragile it really was, and how many people held that fragility together without ever being named. The woman at the center of this myth deserves remembrance, just not for the reason the internet gives her. She wasn't a miracle worker. She was a human being operating under unbearable pressure, inside a system that demanded silence, obedience, and sometimes sacrifice without recognition. And that's where the story should have ended. But it didn't. Because myths don't just survive by accident. They survive because they're useful. In the final part, we're going to confront the hardest question of all. Why does the world need this story to be true? Why are we so eager to believe one woman changed D-Day, instead of accepting the quieter, darker truth about how victory was actually won? And what do we lose, what do we forget, when we choose legend over reality? Because the answer isn't about D-Day at all. It's about how we remember war, and who we allow ourselves to see. Every generation reshapes the past, not out of malice, but out of need. We look back at wars like the Second World War and search for meaning that fits inside a human frame. We want heroes we can name, moments we can point to, stories that end cleanly. And when history feels too vast, too mechanical, too impersonal, we shrink it down until it feels manageable. That's how legends are born. The idea that one woman changed D-Day survives because it gives us comfort. It tells us that history can pivot on a single act of bravery, that the chaos of war can be redeemed by one clear, moral victory. But the truth, the real truth, is heavier. D-Day was not won because of one person. It was won because thousands of people did their jobs without ever knowing if it would matter. It was won because deception was layered so thick that even correct information became useless to the enemy. Because resistance fighters accepted that their reports might be ignored. Because intelligence officers fed lies so consistent that truth drowned in them. Because soldiers climbed out of landing craft knowing the odds and went forward anyway. And women were there at every level of that system, not as symbols, not as legends, but as professionals, couriers, operators, analysts, decoys, and double agents. Some never fired a shot. Some never saw the beaches they helped make possible. Some never lived long enough to know the invasion succeeded. And that is what we risk forgetting when we tell the story wrong. When we say, she changed D-Day, we unintentionally reduce her courage to a result she was never meant to control. We turn lived danger into a punchline. We replace endurance with spectacle. The women of wartime intelligence did not ask to be remembered as miracle workers. They asked to survive. And many didn't. Their heroism wasn't in altering history with a single move. It was in showing up again and again, knowing that success might look exactly the same as failure, and that recognition might never come. That's the story worth telling. Because real remembrance isn't about exaggeration. It's about accuracy with empathy. It's about honoring people for what they actually endured, not what sounds good in a headline. So when you hear the claim again, Orkikyur, the female spy who changed D-Day, pause. Ask what's being simplified. Ask whose silence is being filled with noise. Ask whether the legend is lifting someone up or quietly erasing everyone else. And remember this, the most important contributors to D-Day didn't change it in dramatic fashion. They protected it with patience, with discipline, with lies told convincingly enough to save lives they would never meet. Lest we forget, not the myth we wanted, but the truth they lived. Because sometimes, the bravest thing in history isn't standing in the spotlight. It's working in the dark and accepting that the world may never know your name.